In the late 2010s, America did what it does best: shift gears and take on the next big threat. For years, the US had been laser-focused on the war on terror, fighting enemies who operated in the shadows. But then, something bigger loomed on the horizon. A coalition of authoritarian states, led by China, emerged to challenge the world order, dragging us back into a showdown of great powers. There was no ragtag group of extremists. This was a near-peer threat bristling with missiles, tanks, warplanes, and warships, and America, alongside its allies, prepared for a new kind of fight. But as the US pivoted, terrorism didn't disappear. In fact, today's terrorist groups are more powerful, organized, and well-funded than ever. They've reached levels their pre-9/11 predecessors could only dream of. So how did they get here? Does this mean that after all our battles and sacrifices, the war on terror has failed? The end of the ISIS territorial caliphate in 2019, followed by the death of its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, months later, was an exclamation point on the idea that the war on terror had become of tertiary importance to national and international security. However, the group remains active worldwide under the Islamic State (IS) moniker. It might not have its self-proclaimed caliphate anymore, but it's no less deadly. In March 2024, a regional branch called Islamic State Khorasan Province (ISKP or ISIS-K) attacked the Crocus City Hall music venue in Moscow. The terrorists used Kalashnikov-style rifles and incendiary devices to set fire to the building. The flames spread rapidly, charring the top 2 floors and collapsing part of the roof. 145 people died in the attack, many of them from smoke inhalation. An additional 551 suffered injuries. In a sign of the times, Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine and the West of being involved in the attack. But this absurdity hid the fact that terror groups like ISKP were still enormous threats to international security. The IS terror group has carried out attacks in North America, Europe, Australia, Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East since the end of its Middle Eastern pseudo-state. Since the war on terror began, the US has dismantled major terror networks, delivering blow after blow to groups that threatened global security. But as one threat was eliminated, new ones rose to take its place. The fall of Saddam Hussein's oppressive regime marked a new and complex chapter. The power vacuum drew extremists seeking to dominate the region, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the predecessor to ISIS, was quick to exploit it. The group's founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, introduced brutal tactics and invented ways to fund operations, from kidnappings and ransom demands to organized extortion schemes that burdened local communities. Even former operatives of Saddam's regime seized this chaos, redirecting funds they'd hidden through oil sales to help build up Al-Qaeda in Iraq's operations. Terrorists also turned to the black market to sell oil, using smuggling routes instead of pipelines. But while these terror groups grew more organized, they faced a relentless American military that continually evolved its strategies to weaken their influence. Despite the obstacles, the US remained determined to confront and counter every threat, preventing terror from gaining an unchecked hold in the region. Factions within Saudi Arabia and the wealthy Gulf countries were a third source of financing for the terrorist groups operating at the time. Such financial support came as part of an effort to prevent the Shiite sphere of influence Iran was hoping to create in the region. Saddam Hussein's Sunni regime in Shiite-majority Iraq served as a bastion against the Iranian goal of the Shiite crescent, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, which is why people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states helped to finance him in the face of international sanctions. However, his fall from power greatly assisted Iran's geopolitical ambitions. When he went, the money that had financed him went to finance Sunni terror groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq instead, in an effort to hold back Shiite power. In effect, Washington's war on terror has become enmeshed in the always complicated politics of the Middle East. These messy politics and constantly shifting alliances would play an important part in the rise of ISIS a decade later. Zarqawi was killed in an airstrike in 2006, and the terrorist presence in Iraq lessened considerably with the surge in American forces there the following year. The increased American presence ensured the deaths of most of the group's remaining high and mid-level leaders. The post-Saddam Iraqi government also made it a priority to control the country's oil, reducing the terrorists' ability to finance their activities. However, the methods Zarqawi created were ready to be used again when the Syrian civil war kicked off in 2011. The Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad had, in fact, played host to elements of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, allowing these foreign fighters to use his territory as a transit point to attack the Americans there. When the surge of American forces in Iraq proved effective, many of these foreign fighters limped back across the border and were put in Syrian jails now that they were no longer useful. However, Assad soon found a use for them again. He released many of these terrorists early in 2011, when the Arab Spring revolt began to spread to Syria. Assad hoped to infiltrate these extremists into the protest movement. This was part of an information warfare operation to make it harder for the protesters to secure Western support. For Assad, this should have been an unpleasant trade-off. As an Alawite Shiite Muslim, his regime is naturally aligned with Iran and opposed to the Sunni extremism that these terror groups express. Nevertheless, for Assad, the West was a much bigger threat. To keep the West at bay, he tacitly supported the rise of what would become ISIS in eastern Syria. The mingling of terror groups with the Arab Spring-inspired protest movement paid off for Assad. In interviews, he frequently claimed that his war to stay in power was part of the global struggle against terrorism. The move also meant that Western opinion on the delivery of military aid to rebel groups in Syria would be divided. In such a confused environment, there were justified concerns that many of the Western weapons might wind up in the hands of the wrong groups. While these concerns had merit, they also ensured that Assad faced less formidable opposition than he otherwise might have seen. Even with the divided opposition, the Syrian rebels came close to victory in the first few years of the civil war. Assad required backing from Russia and Iran to beat them off. In the midst of this multi-sided chaos, an even more radical group split off from al-Qaeda and began calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, or the Levant, ISIL. It came to prominence in 2014 when it took over vast swathes of territory in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. ISIS tapped the oil fields that fell under its control and sold the goods to customers on the black market. At one point, ISIS controlled 60% of Syria's oil production capacity. As before, oil would prove to be one of the most lucrative sources for the terror group, and ISIS would gain more from it than its predecessor ever had. The first customers for ISIS oil were the people living in the so-called caliphate. However, cross-border customers included Turkish oil refineries, which in turn shipped refined oil products back across. Authorities in Turkey and Iraq claimed that they were trying to crack down on the practice, but in truth, the oil trade benefited everyone. So it shouldn't be surprising that many an authority turned a blind eye to what was going on, and this willful ignorance went all the way to the top. In assessing the region's politics, Turkey's authoritarian president Recep Tayyip Erdogan made calculations that were similar to his Syrian counterparts. He might not have been personally fond of ISIS, but they were preferable compared to who he saw as his real enemy, the Kurds. Turkey has been waging low-level warfare with Kurdish separatist elements since 1978, and at all costs wants to prevent the creation of a Kurdish homeland. To that end, Erdogan supported the Sunni groups against Assad, either failing to or not caring to distinguish between the different ones. As long as Kurdish elements did not establish a de facto autonomous region in this area, he was satisfied. In 2015, Turkish journalists published videos from a year earlier, showing weapons being delivered from their country's territory to Syria via trucks belonging to Turkish intelligence. These weapons included smaller caliber artillery shells. Some of these weapons made it into the hands of ISIS. Erdogan also did little to impede the flow of terrorists coming from Europe through Turkey to join ISIS. For their tacit support, the Turks suffered a number of terrorist attacks in 2015 and 16, some of them linked to ISIS. Some Western companies also took part in the trade. The French construction giant Lafarge, which was active in Syria until 2014, was indicted on having participated in nefarious financial payments to the tune of $15 million to keep its large cement plant there open. About $500,000 of that money went into the hands of ISIS. The oil payments from Lafarge were as much about extortion as about buying a useful commodity. The oil payments meant that Lafarge could keep the plant open and ensure the safety of its employees coming to and going from the site. Conveniently, these employees were all Syrian. All the foreign employees had left in 2012 when the Syrian civil war began to get much more bloody and radicalized. Like Turkey's tacit support, Lafarge's oil purchases did not stop ISIS from going back on their word. The terrorists attacked and captured the plant in September 2014. 25 Syrian employees had been ordered to stay, but sensibly they fled. In October 2022, the company, now a subsidiary of Switzerland's Holcim Group, pled guilty in an American court to having engaged in over $5 million in financial transactions with terror groups, including ISIS and the al-Nusra Front, and was fined $780 million. It was one of the largest penalties ever imposed on a corporate entity. Charges including crimes against humanity are still pending in France. Company executives have also been personally brought to trial. In all, the oil trade generated $3 million a day for ISIS during its peak years in the mid-2010s. Assad seemed to be content with the loss of the oil fields in Syria's eastern provinces to the terror group. To him, it was better for ISIS to have them than the groups backed by the West. Assad was one of the customers for this oil anyway, so it fell back into his hands. Assad might not have been fond of ISIS or vice versa, but the two had a mutual enemy in the West and the groups that the Western powers backed. Indeed, a man named Firas Talas was one of the intermediaries through which the Lafarge-ISIS trade was conducted. Talas was the son of a former minister of defense who was in office under both Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad. But ISIS got its money through other methods too. The capture of Mosul in 2014 was ISIS's most significant military victory. It was a rich prize. All of the funds from the central bank in the city, as well as the private institutions there, were now in the hands of terrorists. These funds amounted to more than $1 billion. Additionally, Mosul is a large population center. Its population in 2014 was over 1.3 million people. The theft of residence money amounted to another $1 billion at least. At its territorial peak, ISIS pretended to be a state. As such, it imposed what it called were taxes on people living under its control, just as al-Qaeda in Iraq had previously done. Famously, it forced Christians and other groups to pay the jizya tax prescribed in the Quran. ISIS also captured numerous archaeological sites like Nineveh, Nimrud, Hatra, and Palmyra. Videos of ISIS terrorists using drills and bulldozers to demolish these ancient ruins quickly spread on social media in the mid-2010s. However, not everything was pulverized. Rather, the only things that were pulverized were things the group couldn't steal and sell. ISIS found and sold many artifacts from these sites on the international black market for antiquities. These smuggling routes were already well established. They began to flourish in the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein nearly lost power. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003 led to much more widespread looting and export of ancient artifacts. The routes went from Iraq to Kuwait in the south, Turkey in the north, and Israel in the west. Although the trade in antiquities wasn't as lucrative as illegal oil sales, extortion, and mass organized looting, it still brought in a pretty penny for the self-declared caliphate. In 2017, the French security services estimated that the antiquities trade brought in $100 million for the terror group. And Palmyra may have been important in another way. The former leader of Syria's intelligence forces, Colonel Nabil al-Dandal, alleged in an interview with France's Notre Monde that Palmyra was of particular importance in the relationship between the Syrian regime and ISIS. The city was in the region being disputed between the two factions, but there seemed to be a tacit agreement about it. Dandal alleges that on more than one occasion, the Syrian government would ship weapons to ISIS in Palmyra, disguising the traffic in the form of a mock battle between the two forces. The government would then retreat, leaving ISIS with the weapons plus financial aid. The destruction of ruins in Palmyra may have brought too much international attention to the area, and the Syrian government took the city back permanently in 2017. Still, ISIS controlled much of the eastern portion of Syria, and both Assad and his backers in Moscow and Tehran showed comparatively little interest in regaining this portion of the country for the government. Most of their operations were directed toward places like Aleppo, which the Western-backed rebels held until the end of the bloody battle for the city in December 2016, where the regime walked away as the victor. The front has since stabilized. ISIS still controls small pockets of territory surrounded by the Syrian government. Assad has not made a sustained effort to destroy these pockets, nor recover the de facto Kurdish zone in the northeast. The group carries out low-level attacks against targets of opportunity, including forces of the Syrian government. The Islamic State has since been cut off from the trade its so-called territorial caliphate afforded, but it had a financial cushion to survive this blow. According to Notre Monde, it invested between $250 and $500 million in Iraqi companies during its heyday. Meanwhile, there are other ways that the group and its splinter units can conduct operations. The various IS affiliates carried out 1,121 attacks in 2023, 774 of them outside of Iraq or Syria. About 9,000 IS-affiliated fighters remain in detention in Syria, along with 44,000 women and children linked to the organization. The trouble is that IS-affiliated elements typically conduct their attacks for little money. The Kalashnikov rifles and petrol bombs they used in Moscow are easy to come by. Other tools of the trade include simple knives and trucks, the latter of which proved devastating in Nice, France on Bastille Day in 2016, when ISIS claimed responsibility for an attack that killed 86 people and injured 458 more. Interdicting attacks like this requires the surveillance of negligible sums of money, including cash and prepaid cards. These prepaid cards were used to finance the November 13, 2015 terrorist attack in Paris, which killed 130 people and injured 416 others. IS remains a persistent threat in Syria and Iraq, but it's been mostly contained within its old stomping grounds. The group's international expansion presents more challenges now, as seen in Moscow earlier in the year. The aforementioned ISKP, which was responsible for the Crocus City Hall attack, is a much bigger threat in South and Southeast Asia. In Afghanistan, ISKP challenges the legitimacy of the Taliban. Ironically, the Taliban has been forced to implement what it calls counter-terrorism measures against ISKP. In 2023, General Michael Kurilla, the commander of the United States Central Command, which oversees the region, warned that ISKP could attack American targets overseas within a span of 6 months, with minimal or no warning. The attack on Moscow strengthened this prediction. There's less of an organized IS presence in Europe, but the group tries to incite lone wolf terrorist attacks in the name of the fictitious caliphate through internet outreach to radicalized elements. In Southeast Asia, IS affiliates have attacked both civilian and military targets. In the Philippines, there was Abu Sayyaf, the group that swore loyalty to al-Baghdadi and contested control of the city of Marawi in 2017. This group has since been culled, but IS-affiliated individuals remain in the region and have carried out bombings and kidnappings. IS has a much larger presence in Africa. The continent has in part made up for the loss of the group's former territory in Syria and Iraq. A weakening Western presence in West Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, is proving a fertile ground for the terror group to recruit new members and secure new sources of financing. There's also the Islamic State's Central Africa Province, ISCAP, based in Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. It also operates in Uganda with a force between 1,000 and 1,500 fighters. The group has been particularly harmful in Mozambique. A rebellion that began in 2017 pledged loyalty to the Islamic State 2 years later. 6,500 people have been killed and 1.3 million displaced as a result of the affiliates' activities. Counter-terrorism activities have had some success, but in 2024, there was an uptick in violence. IS Somalia has taken advantage of that country's long civil war to entrench itself. This group separated itself from the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Shabaab in 2015 and has taken territory in the Puntland area. There's a headquarters here called Al-Qarar, which helps to coordinate missions, finances, and personnel between the global IS network. It's used its operatives in countries as far away as South Africa to transfer money to ISKP for it to carry out its activities. While it's unlikely that the so-called IS Caliphate will be revived, the group's de facto haven in Somalia could act as a magnet for foreign fighters from the Middle East and Europe to receive training, finances, and weapons to carry out new waves of attacks across the world. As of 2024, the presence of IS on the African continent is one of the most potent threats to international security. Yet the US-led war on terror has been instrumental in weakening terror networks globally. American forces dealt a major blow to ISIS, resulting in a steep decline in terror-related deaths and proving the effectiveness of US counterterrorism efforts. Though a global competition with China and Russia now takes priority, the fight against terror remains a critical mission for the US. While the war on terror may not have a definitive end, America continues its vigilance against emerging threats. In the immediate aftermath of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush made it clear that every nation had a choice to stand with the US and its allies or with the terrorists. Some governments, even those allied with Washington, have tried to play both sides. But American resolve has never wavered. Today, the US stands as a powerful force in counterterrorism, dedicated to keeping extremist networks from destabilizing global security. What do you think will come next in the war on terror? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.